Across this country, bad times are forcing states to cut financial aid to local communities. We look now at the impact of such cuts on the public schools in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Tom Bearden reports.
We want well! We want well! We want well!
On the 218th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, students, parents, and educators from all over Massachusetts came not to protest onerous taxes, but to protest not enough tax money. An ongoing budget crisis had caused Governor William Weld to slash aid to local government, resulting in drastic cutbacks in some school budgets. As Horace Mann, the great champion of public education in America, stood silently by, the protesters vented their anger over the cutbacks. George Counter is superintendent of schools in Holyoke, Massachusetts.
We're here today to tell our representatives that we've had it. We've had it. There's a famous saying out of Boston. It's, wait till next year. Well, we're not going to wait till next year.
The state cuts hit Counter's schools particularly hard. Holyoke, an old industrial city, has been experiencing economic problems ever since the mid-1950s, when its principal employer, the paper mills, began shutting down.
Equals 32.
The city had budgeted a bare-bones $29 million for its 1991-92 school year, an amount well below the state per-pupil average. But last spring, as a result of the state cuts, that was slashed by $5 million. And to make matters worse, city officials handed the schools more than $2 million in repair and utility bills that the city normally paid.
I said, where's the money for those? You were paying them for years. Why don't you transfer the money over? Oh, no. Take it out of your budget. So we got a $5 million direct hit, cruise missile, and 2.6 of a Scud missile to pick up all the bills and everything else.
The results were devastating. 221 teachers, a third of all the city's teachers, and half of all the administrators were let go. And that was just for starters. David DuPont is principal at Lynch Middle School.
The Holyoke Public Schools were hit by a nuclear blast, and the middle schools were ground zero. And I mean ground zero. We took the biggest hit.
How many teachers did you lose?
26 teachers out of a staff of 54.
Almost half.
Almost half.
All of the ancillary programs were cut. There's no physical education, no computer science, no print shop, no music class, no industrial arts.
The teacher who did the industrial arts class here for us last year would stay after school with kids, 30 to 40 kids at a time. They'd stay here for an hour and a half, do their projects. That's all gone. So instead of them being on the streets, they would be here. Now they're on the streets.
Lynch also lost 4 of its 5 buses. Last year, 240 students were bused. This year, only 35. At Holyoke High School, students are now required to pay $100 to participate in team sports. At Sullivan Elementary, enrollment was increased from 400 to 700 after 2 other schools were closed. Some classes now have as many as 40 students. Superintendent Counter tried to stretch his remaining dollars and save some teachers by instituting a longer school day and a shorter 4-day week. The state said no. You got to have the standard 180 days.
I said, this is like Saigon. This is just like Vietnam. We declared ourselves a winner and left. I'm going to declare this year that we had education in Holyoke this year. 180 days. We went 180 days. We had it. We had education here. We stacked them and we packed them in. We controlled them. We managed them. We kept them quiet. We had education here this year.
You called it 180 days of garbage. Is that what it is?
That's what it's turned out to be.
The state cutbacks affected all municipal services, although the schools were hardest hit. Hoyokers had the option to raise property taxes to make up for the loss. But to do that, they had to override a state law limiting increases to 2.5%. Holyoke held 2 override referendums. Firemen, police, and teachers all took to the streets to ask taxpayers for their support.
We're here this morning to ask the citizens of Holyoke to vote yes on override questions 1 and 2 for education.
In the end, recession-strapped taxpayers said yes to increases for the fire department, the police, senior citizens, and trash collection, but no to the schools. Chris Koss, a local jewelry store owner, voted against the school tax increase. She says voters were trying to send a message to school administrators.
Thank you very much. We're very unhappy with the SAT scores. We're unhappy with the dropout rate. We're unhappy. We are second highest in the state of Massachusetts for teenage pregnancies. And we have programs coming out of our ears for this stuff. You know, obviously the money is not being well spent. And when money's not being well spent, if it was a private corporation, they would revamp it and spend it where it would be beneficial.
Lillian Santiago, a Puerto Rican American with 2 sons in Holyoke schools, says complaints about SAT scores and dropout rates are a smokescreen for the principal reason the school override failed: racism. The school system is more than 2/3 Puerto Rican. The taxpayers are mostly white.
When the override didn't pass, I really felt that I felt not wanted. And I thought about all those kids in school, and I really had a real hard time trying to accept what people voted for, trying to understand the white community, and trying not to build up hate, trying to be objective.
Do you think the vote would have been different if the school system was 70% Anglo?
Definitely. Oh, yes.
If there's an ethnic split in the Holyoke community, there's also a generational one. Many of Holyoke's voters are older, with no kids in school, just like many of the customers at Lucchini's, a popular breakfast and lunch spot in a predominantly Irish section of town. We spoke to some of the customers about their reasons for voting against the tax increase.
The average age of Holyoke is increased in the last 10 to 15 years of the homeowner, the taxpayer, per se. And a lot of people, unfortunately, tragically, or realistically, have perceived that they do not have the money at their disposal now, extra income, to pay for something like the school system.
They're wasting a lot of money, and I'd like to see them be more intelligent with the money they have. And then we can give them overrate. I'm a retired guy. I can't afford to pay more money.
Well, our schools are becoming predominantly Hispanic, and we're seeing these kids get out of school. They're not, for the most part, they're not doing anything. They're coming out and they're just, again, they're not educated. The people that are paying the bill are not Hispanic, and they're looking at it and saying, why should we be paying to have some kids that can't even speak English when they get out of school?
Superintendent Counter has heard the same question many times before.
Elected politicians say, why should the taxpayers of this city have to pay for all these poor kids? Why? And I say, maybe because in the year 2030, they're going to be leading the city, and maybe it would be good if they were educated. Or maybe if we spend some money now, we'll save ourselves some money at the other end. Violence, jails, etc., etc., etc.
But clearly they're not listening.
No.
Que es muy famosa y donde nosotros participamos todos los años.
If you had to pin the school tax defeat on one issue, it probably would be bilingual education. In this polyglot community made up largely of the children of Irish, Polish, French, and Puerto Rican immigrants, the language issue is particularly charged.
I would like to see the bilingual education programs removed from our system. Other states that had the same bilingual programs that we have abandoned them and gone into this English immersion, and their students are doing so much better.
The assertion is made that bilingual education is a failure and that the kids ought to be mainstreamed and put in English immersion.
Absolutely, just like they did in the 30s, and then they could all hit the wall in the 8th grade and go work in the mills, only the mills now are in Southeast Asia. They're not here anymore. It is an immersion. It's submersion.
So the chair will entertain a motion at this time to fund that position.
If you ask most Hoyokers whom they blame for the current mess, they point to Governor Weld and Superintendent Counter and the school board. Critics charge school administrators were unresponsive, ignored earlier demands for budget cuts, and spent too much money on programs for the poor and disruptive students. 5 out of the 6 school board members who faced opposition in last year's elections were, in fact, defeated. Ask school officials whom they blame, and they'll tell you,
you can't run schools on referendum. Why are we deciding by a referendum at the local level whether kids should have reading teachers, whether we should have athletic programs for kids, whether we should have reasonable class sizes? That's cuckoo. It's nuts. It's broke. It doesn't work. It needs to be fixed. We need to make a basic commitment to kids, period, in this country, but more specifically in Holyoke and in the state.
In response to all the protests, Governor Weld has promised some emergency funding to help poor communities like Holyoke get through the rest of the year. But given the state's budget crisis, it's doubtful the kind of long-term commitment Superintendent Counter would like is going to happen anytime soon.